The Wanderer's Notebook, Volume 1, by Christopher Emrys. Copyright 2020, all rights reserved. Aurelia, Dinaltier plus 153 TR. Aurelia made her way through the market, enjoying the sunlight on her skin as she frolicked from one stand to another. She was barely aware of her bodyguard, a soldier under her father's command, as he kept pace behind her. Each new stall she visited had some unique item or beautiful new cloth. The buildings around the market were mostly square structures made of clay and brick that shared walls. The market stalls themselves tended to be wooden constructs with fabric awnings that could be set up and closed down each day. Aurelius' guard wore the plated armor of the Riemann Empire that covered mostly his torso and shoulders. Aurelia herself was always dressed in the latest fashions. Her jet black hair fell just past her shoulders, and her eyes were open and bright. "Aurelia, it is so good to see you." Aurelia turned to see Cassandra approaching her from the next stall over. They greeted each other with an enthusiastic hug. Aurelia noted the location of her friend's armed escort a few feet away. "Have you seen this new fabric that just came in?" "I know, it's amazing. Imagine what a beautiful dress could be made out of it." They chatted excitedly as they made their way down the street, each followed by their own escort. "Miss, it is nearly time for your lessons. Your father charged me to make sure you made it to them this time," interrupted Aurelia's guard. Her shoulders slumped and she frowned up at the guard. "Father just wants to ruin everything." She paused, tilted her head, and looked at the guard with a flirtatious smile. "You know, you don't have to do everything Father tells you to." The guard stared at her with a stoic expression. "I must insist. I have my orders." Aurelia slumped again and turned to her friend. "I'm so sorry, Cassandra. I'm afraid I must be going." "It's okay. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. My parents are planning a banquet a week from now. We can catch up then if I don't see you sooner." "Oh, yes, definitely. I cannot wait." Aurelia leaned in and whispered, "Will your cousin be there? He's so handsome in his captain's uniform." Cassandra playfully slapped her on the shoulder. "Gross, he's my cousin." Aurelia's guard cleared his throat and interrupted again. "We must be leaving." "Fine, fine," said Aurelia, rolling her eyes. She hugged her friend goodbye, gave the guard a dirty glare, and made her way down the street. "Stand outside like a good little wet blanket, will you?" said Aurelia as she turned from the guard and entered the dwelling of Koyos, her tutor. "Aurelia, my dear, it's so good to see you," the older man said as he ushered her into the back room where they conducted her studies. Koyos was older than Aurelia's father, with much more gray seeping into his hair. His face was lined with age, his eyes bright, and a smile always at the corner of his lips. "And you as well, tutor," Aurelia said as they closed the door to the back room. "It's good to finally be around an intelligent person," Aurelia quipped as all frivolities dropped from her demeanor. Her eyes hardened, her smile disappeared, and her stride became direct and purposeful. "You know, you don't need to pretend all the time. Would it really be so horrible if the rest of the world knew you as I do? An intelligent and capable young woman?" Aurelia made her way to the workbench and began examining the newest partially dissected specimen. "Their ignorance is my strength. If they think me as vacuous as the rest of them, then they will never perceive me as a threat. This is to my advantage." She opened a scroll and compared the sketches she'd made previously to the specimen on the table before her. "We've dissected these before. Don't you have anything new?" "I do, actually, even if you're changing the subject. Come, it's in the basement." Koyos frequently visited the local docks to acquire new and exotic life forms to examine. He had developed a relationship with the local traders and sailors so that now they would save anything unusual just for him. Some traders from the north caught this creature a few weeks back. They said it was mostly starved and quite vicious when they first found it. That's why they fitted it with the spiked shackles. Unless the creature was being injured by the attempt, it would not cease trying to break free and attack them. They entered a narrow stairway which led down to a lower level that Koyos frequently used for storage and experimentation. Since the house was on the edge of the city near a jagged rocky slope leading down to the sea, the first room of the lower level led to another that opened up facing the slope and the sea. It provided fresh air and an easy way to dispose of dissected animal corpses. Keeping specimens in the lower level also allowed him to more freely study in a space that casual guests would not normally see. The traders had brought the creature down into this first room and chained it inside a cage he kept for live specimens. "What is it?" asked Aurelia as she approached the cage to get a better look, her back straight and hands clasped behind her. The creature was exceptionally pale, male and roughly humanoid. If not for slight movements, she should have thought it to be dead. Its ears were slightly pointed, its body was emaciated, and its fingernails were slightly more claw-like than normal human nails. If it stood up instead of crouching and was an actual man, it would probably be considered a tall one. I don't know, neither did the traders. It speaks in some barbarian tongue that even the traders had never encountered. They also said it reacts quite violently to sunlight, which seems to cause it excruciating pain. Fascinating, muttered Aurelia as she retrieved a mirror from a nearby table. She placed it in a beam of sunlight and tilted it. The beam reflected off the mirror and hit the creature full in the face. It shrieked, closed its eyes, and tried futilely to move out of the light. It was then that Aurelia realized the creature was not just caged, it was chained. She chided herself momentarily for her lack of observation, as Koyos's previous statement about spiked shackles came to mind. The bands of metal around its wrists, ankles, and neck all had spikes protruding inward that were caked with old blood. The creature's flesh was raw and barely healed, where it must have frequently cut itself on the spikes. Disgust grew in her heart as she gazed on a creature so undisciplined and foolish as to cause itself such injury from its own rage. Worm sat in the shadows of the cage listening to the strange babbling of the people who held him captive. He'd been so starved in the few weeks previous that he'd attacked some traders as they camped near the river. His hunger had made him weak, and he'd been subdued easily. They had kept him locked up below deck until they arrived at this sun-cursed land. At least his homeland in the mountains had been cloudy enough to lessen the painful rays of the sun. The voices grew louder as the old man and a young woman came down the steps. He had no idea what they were saying to each other, but the woman stared at him for a while, before she found a mirror and bent the sunlight directly onto him. He instinctively cried in pain and tried to get away, but the chains prevented him from moving more than about half a foot in any direction. He stared at her angrily, even after she removed the beam of light from his face. He could smell the singed hairs on his body, and his eyes still burned. The two humans babbled on a few minutes more, and then the woman did it again, this time aiming the beam at his torso. Worm writhed in pain. Why was she doing this? She tilted the beam away from him. His anger began to build. This was worse than before. He'd spent his whole life being treated like scum, tossed around and beaten whenever the urge struck someone. She was like them. Worm closed his eyes, trying to will the pain away. The woman angled the beam on him again. He hated her. She needed to die. Worm turned and glared at her through the pain of the burning light. It didn't matter anymore how much it hurt. He was going to kill her. He'd put up with being treated like this long enough. Worm strained against his chains, his lips curling in a growl to reveal his sharp, pointed teeth as they ground together. The spikes dug into his flesh, but he didn't care anymore. Bitterness and anger made the pain moot. If his pain would lead to the suffering of this vile creature that kept tormenting him for her own amusement, then it was worth it. Any pain she felt would more than outweigh his own suffering. The woman and the old man were beginning to back away from his cage. Worm pushed harder and harder, his rage helping him ignore the agony as the spikes tore through his skin and into his muscles and tendons. He could feel the blood flowing over the wounds, but he didn't care. The death of his tormentor was all that mattered. Nothing else mattered. He could almost feel the chains about to break. Hatred filled his eyes. And then his eyes began to dim. The blood loss didn't even register to his mind, but it registered to his body. Worm collapsed. The creature's angry outburst died down slowly as its physical damage drained it of the energy needed to fuel such emotions. It would be wise to avoid unnecessarily antagonizing a creature so willing to do itself damage in order to attack you, Koyos admonished. Experimentation and observation are key to learning and understanding everything in the natural world, returned Aurelia. Besides, the chains appeared to be of sufficient quality to hold the creature, and, in the event that they failed, the cage itself would have stopped the creature or delayed it long enough for us to get outside, where sunlight would have protected us. You can see clearly that the flesh is burned where the reflected sunlight touched its skin. Aurelia turned her back on the creature as she replaced the mirror. If all else failed, the guard could have killed it. Multiple contingencies were in place. There was no need to worry. Koyos shook his head, half smiling at her cunning, but slightly disappointed and worried about her coldness. "We should learn what this creature eats so that our subject does not die on us prematurely," he offered. "Not," Aurelia started. "Not more than necessary so that it does not gain enough strength to escape. Yes, I am well aware of that," continued Koyos. He led her back up the stairs and into a side room, where he began to prepare several small bowls with bits of different foods, while Aurelia recited her latest reading assignments, as well as her analyses of the topics they discussed at her last visit. Koyos prepared 6 small bowls, each with its own sampling of one of 6 possibilities: meat, vegetables, or fruit, divided into cooked and raw variations. They returned to the lower level and quietly placed the tray of bowls next to the cage before retreating to a safe distance. Koyos retrieved a couple stools, and they sat and waited, quietly discussing the day's lessons. After some time, the creature began to stir. Koyos watched it closely, also glancing at Aurelia every so often to observe her reactions to it. As usual, her face was impassive, betraying little of her mind's inner workings. He returned to observing the creature. The creature sat up slowly and looked at them. Its eyes hardened into hate as soon as it shifted its gaze from Koyos to Aurelia. Koyos saw no change to her expression in response. Koyos gestured to the food, and it finally began to examine the bowls in front of it. The creature looked at each bowl in turn until it came to the bowl of raw meat. Tentatively, it reached out its semi-clawed hand and picked up the raw meat. Instead of taking a bite like Koyos expected, the creature licked the meat. It then sank its teeth into the meat and seemed to be sucking on it. Koyos looked to see Aurelia raise an eyebrow when the creature finished sucking on all parts of the meat and began to lick up the small amount of blood in the bowl. "It feeds on blood," she whispered. "Fascinating." Koyos turned back to the creature. He looked closely at its emaciated form. The hair was long and unkempt, the skin sickly pale, and the nails almost claw-like. He wasn't sure, but it almost looked like the edges of the burns from the reflected sunlight were beginning to heal even as they watched. He made a mental note to observe carefully any changes in the creature's condition when it consumed blood, so that he would not feed it enough for it to become an insurmountable threat. Aurelia and her father parted ways as she was led to the hall where Cassandra and the other women were holding their half of the banquet. The large rectangular room was supported by an inner rectangle of pillars. The tables were low to the ground, and everyone reclined on cushions while eating. Aurelia greeted her friend and several of the other women before taking her place at the table. Her eyes were wide and bright, a smile of appropriately sympathetic expression always on her face, whenever she spoke with anyone. Most of the conversations detailed the latest fashions, exotic imports, popular playwrights, or captivating gladiators. Aurelia engaged in these topics with bright enthusiasm, only feigning ignorance when the topics shifted to more serious matters. "Have you seen that new gladiator Cassandra's father bought? He's so handsome. They say he's from Elisana. I think they just make those stories up. I'm surprised that Cassandra's cousin hasn't been shipped off to fight against Elisana yet." "Well, actually, he's going to be leading a legion and leaves in 3 months," replied Cassandra. "He's going where? What's Elisana?" asked Aurelia, a look of confusion and worry crossing her face. "My child, for a general's daughter, you certainly know very little," interjected an older woman, with a look of disdain from the other side of the table. Aurelia hung her head slightly. "I'm sorry, the things he talks about are just so boring, it's hard to remember." The woman laughed. Eager to improve the tone, Cassandra continued, "When he returns victorious, he'll be promoted and eligible to join the council." Another woman scoffed. "Your father is spending a lot of money supplying an army and risking his nephew to gain another ally on the council. It won't do much good. Marcus and Castor each control too much of the council for Cassandra's father to ever be elected to the Imperial Senate. I heard that they have a deal where their allies alternate voting between them every cycle, so they take turns representing the region in the capital. I heard that the whole thing almost fell through when one of Marcus's allies discovered that his daughter was the mistress of one of Castor's allies a few years back. They almost came to blows in the council hall. It was a huge scandal." Aurelia listened closely as the night wore on, displaying more interest when topics veered toward the superficial, but feigning just enough ignorance on serious or political matters to elicit explanations and encourage more discussion from those around her. Eventually the feast ended, and Aurelia and her father returned home to their estate. Worm warily watched the old man place the bowl of blood in front of the cage. As soon as he'd backed off, Worm leaped at the bars and grabbed the bowl. He ravenously consumed the red liquid, then lay back against the wall. His eyes closed as he felt his pains ease. A soft scratching sound caught Worm's attention, and he opened his eyes. The old man was sitting on a stool behind a small table in front of the cage, looking intently at him, then down at a parchment on which his stylus scratched. It took Worm several long moments before he realized the old man was drawing him. Worm leaned forward, gestured at his eyes, then at the parchment. The old man lifted it so he could see. The images were a set of variations focused on his neck, with the first showing severe wounds and the rest showing the gradual healing of said wounds. There were markings of some sort near the diagrams, but Worm didn't know what they were. He touched his own neck and realized that there was no pain, and his fingers could not detect a scar. They had been giving him small amounts of blood for the past several days, and he had noticed that he'd started feeling better, but it hadn't occurred to him that less pain meant the wounds had closed. Worm began to look at himself and noticed that his body did not seem so emaciated as before. He stood up and began stretching and flexing his body. He actually felt really good. His thoughts were interrupted by the old man getting up and going back upstairs. After some time he returned with the young woman. Worm glared at her as she entered the room, though his anger toward her was not as great as it once was. He did not like the way she treated him. He had stopped wildly trying to kill her every time she entered the room several days previous, when the chains had torn his body so badly that he'd passed out, and awakened to find that he couldn't clench his fists any longer. He clenched them now, released, and sat down. He could wait. Worm stared mindlessly into the distance until the slightly more agitated actions of the old man caught his attention. He stared intently at them as they continued speaking in their strange language. The old man did not seem happy about something, but the young woman showed no expression as she gestured toward Worm. An image of a knife cutting into his hand flashed through his mind. His two captors continued their discussion for a few seconds more before the young woman reached for a knife on the table. The old man put his hand over hers, stopping her from picking it up. The young woman relinquished the knife and returned upstairs, followed shortly afterward by the old man. The full moon's rays peeked over the roofs of the buildings just enough to allow Aurelia and Cassandra to make their way. Aurelia kept the hood of her cloak pulled close over her face to ensure no one would accidentally recognize her as she followed her friend. Cassandra would look back from time to time with an excited smile or stifled giggle, and Aurelia would return one in kind. Eventually they reached a door at a dead end in a narrow side street and put on their masks. The masks were plain wood, carved to resemble nondescript human features. Cassandra knocked on the door and a small window was opened. Aurelia could make out a pair of eyes peeking through as Cassandra raised her palm toward the door, revealing the symbol hidden on the underside of a silver ring. The window was slammed shut, the door was opened, and the two entered. A servant with a lantern led them down a flight of steps and around a corner into a large, open, dimly lit room whose roof was supported by an inner ring of pillars. The room was crowded, so Aurelia and Cassandra held hands so as to not lose each other. They maneuvered their way to the right side of the room, still near the back. Aurelia scanned the crowd. Many wore cloaks, but some wore their normal attire, undisguised. Judging by the materials, colors, and designs, most of the attendees were likely to be the offspring of the city's wealthier families. Every now and then she spied rougher, more calloused hands, meaning that there were servants or soldiers in attendance as well. These back-alley cults were known to crop up from time to time, catering to thrill-seeking youths eager to rebel against the more established temples and deities. Aurelia kept her free hand on the dagger she had hidden in the folds of her dress. These cults were also sometimes the cause of the injury, death, or disappearance of the city's wealthy youth. Despite the risk, Aurelia was interested in the opportunity such an organization presented. It gave access and influence to wealthy families while maintaining anonymity. Rising to the ranks of such a secretive cult was much less conspicuous than attempting such through one of the more established temples. The priest entered from a doorway at the far end, near the altar, and the rituals began. "Why do you cut open the animals?" Worm asked Koyos as he watched the old man cut open and examine another strange sea creature. Once he was well fed and healed, pain and hunger no longer consumed his mind. Over time he had learned his captors' language, but had little reason to speak with them. He was still caged like an animal, after all. While they might seem nice, they were hardly trustworthy. He had watched them discuss a strange array of topics, many of which did not seem immediately useful or important. They would even cut open various animals, but never eat them. Eventually the strangeness of it all got the better of him. Koyos looked over at him and replied, I dissect the specimens in order to learn more about them. Since the animals are usually brought to me by fishermen, I am unable to observe their behaviors, but I can observe how they are composed internally. Why do you care? If it's not food or clothes, what use is it? Worm watched Koyos set down his knife and turned to face him more fully. We observe the world in various ways and ponder our observations so that we can better understand how the universe works. The world works by the strong preying on the weak. If we're hungry, we eat. If we're tired, we sleep. Why should we care about some fish we've never seen? What's the point? Curiosity is usually a driving factor, but observation and meditation can lead us to new ideas and understandings. It's true that they sometimes are not immediately useful, but the key is to learn how a principle in one thing can be applied to another. Through my many dissections, I have learned that there are similarities between the organs of many animals. Different types of fish are more similar to each other than to different types of birds. Animals like dogs and horses fall into another category as well. With my prior work on the battlefield, I have seen the insides of humans. From observing the patterns in all of these creatures, I can look at you and estimate where your heart is, how to kill you, and how to stitch you back together. Worm stepped back slightly. Do you intend to dissect me like you do the fish? Koya stood with his hands behind his back and took a step forward. No. Again, let us observe the patterns and consider what they mean. You have a very similar form to myself and all other humans, yet your skin is much paler, your nails more claw-like, your teeth much sharper, and your ability to heal much faster. The differences are significant enough for me to know that you are unique, but not so dissimilar to make me think that you are a lesser creature. While animals may have similar reactions as humans to kindness and pain, you have also learned our language and are now exhibiting signs that your mind is capable of pondering what is both within and without, much like a human. Worm paused. What the old man said made sense, but still seemed strange. He turned, sat back down in a corner of his cage, and stared off into space. The old man returned to his table and his dissections. If you think I'm like you, then why do you keep me caged and chained? The old man didn't turn around. That is another lesson. Make sure you learn from what you observe and do not make the same mistakes. The traders who sold you to me informed me of your violent outbursts, which is why they chained you as they did. I then observed how you were so enraged by Aurelia's cruelty that you were willing to damage yourself in order to hurt her, even to the point where it might have killed you. Such behaviors lead me to believe that you are prone to being controlled by your rage and bitterness, and that you do not value reason or peace. While I am delighted to learn more about you through conversation, it would be unwise of me to allow you too much freedom, lest your rage lead to my own death. Worm wasn't sure if the old man was being condescending, but the dismissal of his righteous fury in regard to Aurelia's cruelty rekindled his rage. He stood quickly and stepped toward the bars. Why shouldn't I be angry? Why shouldn't I kill those who torment me? The old man sighed, placed his palms on the table, and leaned into them. There are various philosophical and religious reasons that people do not hurt others, even those who hurt them. Some place a high value on human life, while others focus on seeing the world from the perspective of others. There is even a new religion spreading across the empire that encourages its adherents to love their enemies. If nothing else, consider what is in your own best interest. Killing or permanently damaging yourself is not helpful for you in the long run. If you are patient and control yourself, you can avoid unnecessary harm to yourself, and you may be able to achieve something greater in the future. The more you achieve, the less past wrongs will bother you. Worm glared at the old man. He still saw no reason to care for these humans, and especially no reason to love an enemy, but he could see the value in waiting if it got him what he wanted. Perhaps he should give more consideration to patience. A few years went by, and Worm learned as much as he could from Koyos and Aurelia. He even allowed them to cut him and time how long it took for his wounds to heal. The pain still angered him, but over time he was able to better control it. The more well-fed he was, the faster he healed. While learning more about his abilities was fascinating, he still did not trust them, especially Aurelia. Worm would wait for her to leave before engaging Koyos in conversation. His newfound eagerness to learn encouraged him to speak to the old man, but his bitterness kept him silent before the girl. Oddly enough, it seemed like Koyos respected this decision, as Aurelia never showed any signs that the old man had told her about their conversations. For a time, Aurelia's visits became much less frequent, but eventually she returned. One night she arrived in the darkness with several armed guards. They used loops of rope on the ends of long poles to move Worm from his cage to another, smaller cage outside. He was forced into this new container, and a cover was placed over it. He didn't know where they went, but when the cover was removed, he found himself in an empty marble room. The room was rectangular with a marble pedestal and bowl at one end, and several holes through which his chains fed were on the other. The guards left and Aurelia entered. She stood near the door in the center of one of the side walls. This will be your new home. You will notice that your chains can allow you to move freely, but they can also be pulled through the holes so that you are unable to move. She looked over her shoulder toward the open doorway, nodded, and Worm felt the chains in his body being pulled back toward the wall. She raised her hand and it stopped. Aurelia gestured toward the marble bowl, and Worm noticed a pipe protruding from the wall above the bowl. We will supply you with blood through there. As long as you cooperate, your chains will be loose and you'll be well fed. Worm looked at her. She seemed slightly older now, and more serious. In the cage in Koyos' home, it was hard to measure the passage of time, and Worm began to wonder how many years had passed. Aurelia entered the temple from a secret entrance behind the large statue of the temple's deity. It was a strange mix of human and animal that was predominantly snake and human. Her face was concealed behind a mask formed in the likeness of a human-snake hybrid, with noticeably large fangs. Her robes were a deep dark red, reminiscent of dried blood. She looked past the base supporting the statue at the assembled worshippers. The temple was a long rectangle extending away from the idol with pillars spaced out along either side. The majority of the worshippers were arrayed between the two rows of pillars in the open space, all face down before the deity's image. An altar had been placed in front of the idol, and both stood on a raised platform several steps higher than where the majority of the worshippers were positioned. On either side of the altar were hooded figures, all wearing red cloaks in contrast to the white cloaks of those below. Aurelia made her way to her place between the idol and the altar, careful to avoid the steps that descended directly in front of the idol to the cult's second circle of chambers. On the other side of the altar, a young woman knelt on the steps of the dais, the newest candidate for the cult's inner circle. "Welcome, child. Are you prepared to step from the third circle into the second circle of devotion?" Aurelia asked, looking down at the woman's bowed head. "Yes, please accept these two prime slaves as sacrifice to show my devotion to our cause." Two blindfolded slaves were then brought forth, one man and one woman. They were forced down onto their knees on either side of the altar. "Our master requires our obedience and devotion in both life and death," Aurelia declared. She grabbed the man's hair, slit his throat, and shoved the bleeding gash toward the bowl-shaped depression in the center of the altar. As the male slave ceased moving, Aurelia turned to the woman and cut her blindfold. "This man's death serves our master, as your life will now serve him." The guards came and carried the woman down the set of steps in front of the idol, leading into the inner chambers of the cult. Aurelia stepped around the altar, placed her hand in the blood, then looked down at the supplicant. "Look at me," she commanded. The young woman looked up, and immediately Aurelia's blood-covered hand gripped her throat, fingers curling in around the trachea and between the tendons, her sharpened fingernails making small cuts in the skin. Aurelia glared into the woman's eyes, relishing slightly the fear she could see in them. "Let this blood and these marks forever remind you that your life is in my hands, and my hands serve the master." "I am forever bound," replied the woman as she closed her eyes. Worm instinctively knew what time it was, and walked across the barren stone room to the pipe and the bowl below. After a few minutes, blood began to pour out. He eagerly lapped it from the bowl until the flow stopped. It was human blood. He could tell by the rush of energy and strength he felt whenever he drank it. Aurelia had previously noticed the changes in his demeanor when he was fed human instead of animal blood. She later explained that the blood came from the sacrifices of the cult she ran. It was not lost on him that her ability to deduce this was due to his lack of self-control over his more subtle characteristics, and that her telling him was her way of demonstrating that he could not hide things from her. This had motivated him to work more to conceal his true feelings, Yet, with the general boredom of sitting in a stone box with nothing to do, he would forget frequently. The long expanses of time between the feedings left Worm little else to do other than to alternate between mentally shutting down while staring off into space and contemplating the things he'd observed and learned when he lived in Koyos's cage. As a result, he would reach valuable conclusions, but would then lose the drive and motivation to make anything of them. After some time, the chains bound to the spiked shackles around his neck, wrists, and ankles began to pull him, and he walked back to the far side of the room and sat down. Aurelia entered a moment later, followed by a guard and a rather frightened-looking slave girl. "You may leave us," Aurelia commanded the guard, who bowed obediently, left, and closed the door behind him. "You will be rewarded if you assist me with a series of experiments," she continued. "What kind of experiments?" Worm asked cautiously, looking the visitor up and down. Her hair was dark, her body neither emaciated nor plump. He could see that her hands were only slightly calloused, and her eyes looked at things intently. Perhaps, he thought, she was a more educated slave, and not one used for hard labor or previously owned by a harsh master. "I would like to examine the full range of your abilities and characteristics. Some of these experiments may require the examination of your blood, and others will require you to utilize your abilities." "Well, I don't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon, so I have plenty of time, but I am curious as to how this would benefit me," Worm replied. "The more one learns of one's own abilities, the more one can accomplish. Also, you will no longer need to feed on the stale remnants of our ceremonies. You will have fresh meals." At this the slave looked fearfully between Aurelia and him. He wondered what horrible thoughts were racing through her mind. "That sounds reasonable. What is her name?" "Let's call her One." Aurelia turned and walked to the door. The guard opened it, and as Aurelia stepped through the doorway, she called back over her shoulder, "Your first experiment is to drain her." Worm felt the chains go slack as the door latched shut and the bar was placed across it. He stood and took a step toward the girl. She backed away from him and he smiled. This would be fun, he thought. It would give him something to do and something to ponder, especially since he wasn't fully sure of his own limits. Worm dashed to the woman, gripped her shoulders, and sank his teeth into her throat. The blood poured out, and he gulped it down greedily. He was barely aware of her feeble attempts at breaking free of his grasp. Eventually the blood stopped, and Worm became aware of his surroundings again. The woman in his hands was dead. He let her body drop to the floor as he closed his eyes. The power coursing through him was something he had not experienced in many years. This much fresh human blood made him feel like he could take on the world, and nothing could stop him. He clenched his hands into a fist, one finger at a time, his mind caressing the chains behind him, wondering if he could break them. Worm sighed. It would be best to wait. Even if he could break free, it would not do for Aurelia to find out before he was ready. He looked down at the lifeless corpse. He knew what would happen, but had never taken the time to closely observe it before. Worm sat back down, leaning against the wall, his right arm resting on his raised right knee, and stared at the corpse expectantly. Eventually, the corpse twitched. Aurelia made her way around the perimeter of the creature's newest chamber. Unlike the last one, this one had a series of small rooms evenly spaced along the length of the rectangle, with the main entrance on one end and the retractable chains on the other. There were 5 cells on either side, each housing, or soon to house, a specimen for experimentation. Grooves ran along the floor from each cell and down toward a depression in the floor near the chains so that any excess blood would be available for the creature to feed on. There were also 5 stone tables fitted with chains and spiked shackles arranged end to end down the center of the room. Grooves in them also led to the creature's feeding trough. She looked at the bars of the newest test subject, recently branded 57. The subject was significantly older than most of her test subjects. He was a blind beggar that none would miss. Aurelia made a gesture and a guard opened the cell, pulled the man out, dragged him to a table, and chained him down. She nodded and the guard left the room and closed the door. "What is the experiment for today?" asked the creature from his seat on the floor at the far end of the room. Aurelia brought forth a small vial of the creature's blood from a pouch in her belt and opened it. "We're going to test the extent of the restorative power of your blood on a living, non-transformed specimen." She dispensed 3 drops of the red liquid into the eyes of the old man and watched. She had seen the blood heal lacerations on contact and expected something similar, but nothing happened. Perhaps his eyes do not heal because his body is not trying to repair damage to them right now, offered the creature. Aurelia paused and considered. This was a good suggestion, and the creature had steadily shown more aptitude and helpfulness in her experiments. But his ability to so clearly see what was going on from such a distance was somewhat worrisome. She was pleased that she had decided to always keep the creature in check and restrained when she was in the room with him. With one swift movement, Aurelia drew a large needle from her belt and stabbed the old man's right eye. He screamed and fought against his chains. Aurelia grabbed his head, pried his eye open, dropped 3 more drops of blood into the damaged eye, and watched it heal. The man's thrashing stopped, and his newly restored eye turned toward her and glared. Excellent suggestion. Do you think there may be a way to restore his whole body without inflicting wounds on him? Perhaps the restorative powers interact with the subject's own blood when there is a wound, or with the healing process itself. If the blood doesn't restore from being poured over the eye, perhaps it is because it is merely contacting the surface of things and not the interior. How best should we transfer the blood to the interior of the subject? Aurelia mused over this. We could attempt to inject it into the bloodstream as a snake does its venom, or we could see what happens when ingested. She grabbed the old man's head, inserted a device to hold his mouth open, and poured the rest of the blood into his mouth. She stepped back and watched. There was no immediate change, but even the creature had taken time to heal when she had first met him, so perhaps the same would hold true now. It would be best to have a more precise way to measure and test the injection methods. Her one concern was that ingesting the blood, or even injecting too much, might cause a complete transformation. The goal was to take the creature's power without its weaknesses. She walked away and indicated at the door for the guard to enter and return the subject to his cell. Worm sat and watched from his end of the room, staring at the 5 newest subjects all chained down to the stone tables in preparation for Aurelia's daily studies. He thought they were numbers 87 through 91. He had transformed all of them a few days ago, and they had been fed daily with human blood. Aurelia's newest set of tests were designed to look for weaknesses of the creatures, since she had already learned how to steal some of their strengths. By this point, it had been several years since he had last spent time among people, but he was still fairly certain that Aurelia should have been showing more signs of aging by this point than she was. He knew she'd developed a glass vial with measured markings attached to a hollow metal spike, so that she could inject measured amounts of his blood into her. This was most likely slowing her aging, as well as enhancing her strength. Worm had been rather surprised at her display of genuine elation the day she came in and explained how she had been angered by a guard and lifted him off the ground with one hand. He wasn't sure what other advantages the blood was giving her, but he secretly hoped it did not impart all of his growing abilities. Having seen the blood's benefits, Aurelia was looking to make sure she didn't inherit any weaknesses. His thoughts were interrupted by Aurelia storming into the room with an exceptionally irritated look on her normally stoic visage. He watched as she walked to the subject on the first table. She began lacerating the subject and pouring various substances into the wounds to observe how the flesh reacted. Her movements were unusually rushed and frustrated, lacking the meticulousness that they usually possessed. Has something gone wrong? He asked. This is all that bastard's fault, she growled as she plunged the knife deep into the creature's chest. Your husband? Has he done something? Has he lost status? I thought you said he'd risen quite successfully through the ranks. Aurelia turned and glared at him. The bastard got me pregnant. I can't risk continuing to take the blood in case it causes a mutation in the child. I don't want one of these creatures going inside of me and clawing its way out. If I can't take the blood, that leaves me vulnerable to attack, or even to being replaced if the effects of the pregnancy deteriorate my appearance enough that he decides to move on to a younger, more politically beneficial bride. Worm restrained a smile at Aurelia's frustration. It was an unusual sight for him. If I remember our previous conversations accurately, your husband has risen to the ranks by virtue of his own honor and benevolence, combined with your secret machinations. He is intelligent enough to be good at his occupation, but not so cunning as to contemplate the less honorable aspects of politics and rule. With that in mind, I find it unlikely that he would replace you. He watched as the anger began to ease out of Aurelia's face while she stood over the test subject, staring blankly at it. Besides, should the pregnancy damage you, you could always cut the child out of you and pour the blood in the wound as a quick fix. This seemed to alleviate her final wisps of anger. Worm smiled inwardly. He could see both the external signs of her acceptance of the situation, as well as the images of the contingency plans forming in her mind. Aurelia held her child for the first time and felt as if she had never even been capable of thinking about this beautiful creature as anything other than the most important thing in her life. Several weeks passed where she spent all her time with her new daughter, ignoring all their duties and goals. Despite her newfound devotion, Aurelia eventually returned to her role as dutiful wife and covert high priestess. Years passed and her followers grew in number, rank, and utility. My lady, a red-cloaked devotee said as he knelt before Aurelia in one of the inner chambers of the cult. She looked out through the eyes of her mask, down at the young soldier whose true loyalties were contained within the walls of the room in which they stood. Tell me, has your general made his decision on whether or not he intends to march his forces to the capital? He has. We march in 2 days. Such blatant arrogance is an affront to the wishes of our master, Aurelia replied, reaching into her robes and producing a small vial. Pour this into his wine tonight, so he may taste our master's displeasure. As the master wishes, and as you command. The guard accepted the vial, and, with head bowed, left. Aurelia made her way back through the secret tunnels to her chambers and in her husband's estate, leaving her ceremonial robes and mask behind. It was time for her to check with her daughter Julia's tutors. None of the tutors she could find lived up to Koyos' legacy, so she had hired 3 of them to try making up the difference. She strode purposefully into the chamber where the tutors were waiting. Give me your reports, she said as she took her seat and the 3 tutors knelt before her. Your daughter has surpassed my expectations in mathematics and natural philosophy, for one as young as her, replied the first tutor, an older, slender man with graying hair. Excellent, she turned to the second. Her grasp of history and geography is progressing quite nicely. Her questions are probing and insightful, reported the second tutor, a middle-aged man with a slight limp from an imperfectly healed battle wound. Good. Her reading and reasoning skills are quite developed for a 10-year-old child, remarked the third tutor, a middle-aged woman with the faintest hints of gray showing in her hair. I am pleased with your reports, Aurelia stated. Is she still holding on to this imaginary friend of hers? The man with the funny smile has not been mentioned for quite some time, replied the third tutor. We had many debates about the frivolity of imaginary friends. Eventually she stopped talking about him, and, when asked, she says she no longer dreams of him. Thank you all for your service. Continue to excel in training my daughter, and your lives here will be quite pleasant. The 3 tutors laughed. The years passed, and Aurelia watched her daughter grow into a beautiful and intelligent young woman. Mother, I have noticed that you have not aged as the mothers of my friends have, Julia commented while they sat together reading one day. Aurelia set down her scroll and looked at her daughter. For a brief moment she debated telling her daughter of her secrets. I have been gifted with slower aging, but I can feel age beginning to creep in these last few years. She wasn't fond of deceiving her daughter, but secrets only survived when they went unshared. How fortunate, Julia responded and continued reading. Aurelia gently stroked the vial of worm's blood that she wore around her neck and went back to her reading. Aurelia watched her daughter converse with her friends in the courtyard. They were all smiles and laughter. She could see a lot of herself in Julia. Even now she noticed that her daughter portrayed more playfulness among others than she did when they were alone. Mother, come show my friends some archery, she said, running up beside her. I'm not sure that is the sort of thing they would be interested in, Aurelia replied. Oh yes, please teach us. My father won't let me practice. Okay, sighed Aurelia. She made her way to the side of the courtyard and retrieved a bow and a few arrows. She demonstrated how to nock the arrow and took aim at a fruit on a tree several yards away. The arrow pierced the fruit and it fell. Oh, let me try. Be careful, this isn't a toy, warned Aurelia. The first girl took aim and missed the tree entirely. The second hit the tree. Aurelia walked over to the tree to retrieve the arrows. She placed one hand on the trunk, well away from the arrow, and wrapped the fingers of her other hand around the shaft. As she began to pull, a slight sound caught her attention. Without thought, Aurelia spun, her right hand releasing the trapped arrow and sweeping across the space in front of her head. She felt the edge of her hand contact something smooth and thin, beginning to push it aside. Her fingers wrapped around the object, and she looked straight ahead. Aurelia dropped the bow, a look of panic washing over her face. Her 2 friends were not paying attention. Aurelia looked down at her right hand and saw an arrow clutched there. I'm so sorry, Mother. It was an accident, pleaded Julia as she rushed to meet her. Aurelia comforted her daughter and departed as soon as seemed appropriate. When she returned to her chambers, she clenched her fists and snapped the arrow. How could she be so stupid? Eventually, her daughter would figure out that she wasn't just gifted or lucky. Her mind and heart were torn between her desires to protect her daughter and to protect herself. Giving up her power was unacceptable, but she could never manage a confrontation with her daughter. Her only option was to disappear from her daughter's life and live only in the shadows of the cult. That would allow her to retain and gain control in the Empire while protecting her daughter. Having made up her mind, Aurelia set about preparations for a trip along the coast. Carriages fell off cliffs all the time. The carriage raced along the road as the sun set. Aurelia opened a small box and extracted a glass vial of Worm's blood and a syringe of her own design. She drew out the blood and injected it into her veins. The power surged through her. This was more than she usually used, but her tasks ahead would require the extra strength, and she didn't want to risk the effects wearing off too soon. Faster than a human eye could follow, she opened the carriage door and climbed onto the roof. The sound caused the guard, seated next to the driver, to look back. She reached forward, grabbed him by the head, and threw him over the cliff. The guard's screams caught the driver's attention. Before he could turn too far, Aurelia struck him across the back of the head, in the direction away from the cliff and toward the road. He fell in a heap on the ground, unconscious. She climbed down and rushed along the backs of the horses to jump in front of them. As soon as she landed, she spun around and drew her dagger. The force of her fist, the slash of the blade, and her sudden appearance scared the horses, and they lurched toward her left and the cliff's edge. As they attempted to pass her, she gave a quick shove, and they tumbled over the edge. The journey back had gone fairly quickly, as Aurelia found herself able to move faster than the horses. She'd never fully tested the speed that Worm's blood bestowed over such long distances. It was exhilarating. Once inside the cult's underground labyrinth, she began to relax. Living the rest of her life in such obscurity would be worth it once her reach extended to the capital. She didn't need to be in the spotlight, just to have control. She made her way through the twisting passages until she reached the chambers of the high priestess of the cult. She unlocked the door and entered. The opposite wall was lined with shelves containing hundreds of scrolls. Some were reports from her spies, others were recently written works by the philosophers, and others were her own records. To her left was a long table at which she would perform experiments, study the scrolls, or create her own. On the right was a small bed. Her red robes of office hung in the center of the shelves. She reached to her right and felt only stone. Her robes weren't supposed to be by the shelves. She always hung them on the rack to her right, but it was empty. Instinctively, Aurelia clutched the handle of her dagger and stood with one foot forward, ready to pounce on her intruder. Who are you? The robe slowly turned around. Mother, I'm so glad you're alive, exclaimed Julia, a smile spreading across her face. We were worried that something unfortunate might have happened on your journey. Aurelia took a step back in surprise. How had Julia even found this place? Her daughter walked forward to embrace her. Confusion froze Aurelia momentarily, and she allowed the embrace. Julia looked at her and reached out to gently stroke Aurelia's face. Don't worry, Mother. I wanted to make sure I saw you at the height of your strength and beauty one last time. Aurelia blinked as her daughter's words began to process. What did she mean by we? Something wasn't right. She quickly moved away from her daughter and looked around. What did you mean by we? With a speed far greater than her human daughter should have been capable of, Julia closed the distance between them. How did you? She began angrily when she felt the cold slice across her throat. Blood gurgled in her throat as Aurelia dropped to her knees. It's okay, Mother. Soon you shall be at peace. Worm walked out from the shadows and stood behind her daughter. Julia turned and greeted him with a hug. You have done well, my beautiful child, he said as he stroked her hair. Now go prepare to meet your new congregation. Julia kissed his cheek and left the room without looking back. Worm crouched down next to Aurelia as she tried in vain to hold in the blood pouring from her neck. The wound was healing faster than normal, but not fast enough. Too much time had passed since the injection. I should thank you. You have taught me more than I ever could have imagined. Academics, cunning, manipulation, ambition, and patience. He finished with an icy tone. He reached out, dipped his finger in her blood, and brought it up to his face to examine. With one long lick, his tongue wiped the blood clean from his finger. Your daughter is amazing. already so much more than you. Together, no empire can stand against us. You have been my captor and tormentor for years, but you have also been my teacher. For that, I offer you this one reprieve, peace." With that, Worm reached out and snapped her neck. For one fleeting moment, she realized she could not feel her body any longer. The moment ended as the cracking sounds in her skull reached their climax. Did you like the story? Recommend it to a friend. Did you hate the story? Recommend it to an enemy. Best of all, don't tell them how you felt about it first.